Hello, welcome to my recap of the game between Magnus Carlsen and Jan-krzysztof Duda. This was round 9 and both players were leading after 8 rounds. And we got a really interesting game and let's get to it immediately. We had the Sicilian, but Duda surprised in some way Magnus on move 2. He played knight f6, which is not so often played. There are some interesting lines here. After e5 here, knight c3 was played, and there is some line like going with e6, and after this capturing d4, knight c6. Black gives up the pawn, but white's king stays in the center after this, and after a long variation I think that there is something like bishop c4, bishop f2, king e2, and then rook f1 and knight g5 targeting f7 pawn. For example, if black castles, then rook f1, bishop goes back, and now after knight g5 there is d6. It's a really interesting variation, but I'm not gonna go deeper than that. Duda chose different approach and he took on c3, and he enters the variation in which his pieces don't have much space, especially because of the e5 pawn, which makes black's position really cramped. He continues developing by knight c6 and now h4. Magnus in some way anticipates black's kingside castle and prepares with h4, and also to somehow expand with h4, h5 at some point. Duda continues with e6. Now his idea is to push d6. For example, if Magnus skips one move, let's say he plays bishop d3, then Duda gets away with this and he plays d6. You will see that black's structure is healthier than white's, because look at the queen side. He has 4 pawns, but in a potential endgame it's really useful for black to have this extra pawn on the other side. So to stop d6, he plays bishop f4. Queen c7. He's getting ready for some b6, bishop b7. Also, he's targeting the bishop indirectly. So he wants to make himself free by playing a move like f6, which would in some way liberate his pieces. And that's why Magnus plays queen d2 to stop f6. If black manages to eliminate this pawn on e5, he will be doing fine. Until then, it's always going to be somewhat unpleasant. He plays h6 now. The point of this move is maybe to stop any knight g5, knight e4s in the future, and also he prepares maybe bishop e7 with rook g8 and g5 somewhere in the future, not immediately. Now Magnus continues developing by bishop d3 and now b6. Now bishop e4. He wants to potentially eliminate the bishop on c8, which might become a really powerful force. Bishop b7 and now c4. Knight a5 and they exchanged bishops and Magnus castled. Duda plays queen c6 and now queen c3. He prepares doubling on the d file, and also he's targeting g7. He wants to stay on this diagonal because in case of some d6 he would target g7 and the bishop couldn't move from f8. Duda continues with bishop e7. He stays flexible. Now rook d3, which was an inaccuracy. The better move was rook h e1, and it will be clear later on why is this such a good move. So, first question you might ask, why rook h e1? Well, Duda now plays queen e4. Now the bishop is under attack. Magnus plays g3, knight a5, trying to provoke b3, so white doesn't have any rook lifts or queen lifts on the queen side. And also he wants to transfer his knight to c6, where it's much better. Now rook h d1, attacking d7 pawn, and now probably the better solution was to go for a castle and going for rook g8, g5 next. If you go for something like this, then king b8, for example, b3, knight c6, you keep putting pressure on the e5 pawn, and you might get rook g8, g5 next, trying to push this bishop from f4. In that way, when you push the bishop, you make e5 pawn more vulnerable. He chose rook d8, staying in the center, staying flexible. not allowing white to focus on one side of the board. And Magnus plays knight d2, defending the pawn on c4, and also wants to free his rook on d3 and queen on c3. Queen goes to f5. There are some ideas like knight c6, knight b4, trying to harass this rook and also to target a2. So Magnus plays rook f3. He stays away from knight c6 ideas and knight b4, and also puts some pressure on the queen indirectly. But now Duda just ignores this and plays knight c6, which is very clever. The idea behind this is very clever. Okay, but what happens on bishop h6? I just grab a pawn and I should be doing fine. That's what Magnus did. And now knight d4. And now this really interesting resource. He attacks the rook on f3. He wants to play knight e2. And also the bishop is under attack. It seems that white is inevitably going to lose some material, but for example, if you take the queen, there's knight e2, and after this you just capture, and in the end you will capture on f5, and that's just better for black, a better version of what happened in the game. Because if you take on g7, there's rook g8, because after this you can play d5 even. And now once the position opens up, it's tougher for white with the exchange down. What can white do here? Here he took on d4, and now Duda takes on f3, because if you decide to take immediately, then rook f5, after this, bishop g7. And when the rook moves to h7, bishop f6, takes. And if black tries to open up the position by d5, which is logical when you have two rooks against a rook and a light piece, now white has knight f3 and eventually he gets initiative. After rook e5, he will win the f-pawn, although it doesn't have to be taken. For example, if you play f4, then he can just pass with g4, start pushing those pawns on the king side. He took on f3 instead, knight f3, and now cd. Bishop g7, and now we have 8 pawns versus 6 pawns. This bishop on g7 looks pretty badly placed, so it has to somehow exchange itself for the bishop on e7. So black is forcing that by rook h7, not allowing bishop h6, and now bishop f6, takes, and rook h6. The f6 pawn is doomed, but Magnus took on d4, and now f4 was played. And now the only problem for white is this g3 backward pawn. If black manages to somehow get pressure on g3, then black's conversion of this advantage might become tougher. So black tries with king e7, prepares rook g6, rook g8, targeting the g3 pawn. Rook d3 now, trying to support the pawn, but not on the g-file because of some potential pins on the g-file, which would be quite embarrassing for white. Now rook c8, very clever move. The point behind this move is to force white to play b3. And why do you want white to play b3 as black? Well, Magnus played b3, and now he's not allowed to get rook a3 to harass the a7 pawn. That's why rook c8 was played. And now black continues his plan by rook g6, knight e2, rook cg8, and now king d2. Prepares his king to get to f2 so he can free his knight from e2 or the rook. Now d6, a4, and now Duda tries to be active by playing e5. He has to do that because if he doesn't, then white is just going to roam around and he's going to break through eventually by something like rook d1, rook a1, a5. He has to keep some tension in the center. If he keeps the pawn on e6, there's no tension, and eventually white would arrange his pieces perfectly and probably get his knight to e3 with the rook on g1, and he would slowly put pressure on black. So e5 is understandable. Duda doesn't want to defend passively. Now rook f3. The threat was to capture an f4 and to weaken the kingside pawns, because the knight still cannot move from e2. So in case of some eventual capture, then white would have to capture with the g pawn, which makes both pawns quite weak. So rook f3. Now the point of this move is that after capturing, he would capture back with the rook. These pawns look very good, and black's pawns seem like the ones that need more protection. He tries this, rook g4, and now king e3. He went for king e6, and now finally the king gets to f2. Rook g7, and now rook e3. King f5. Rook d3, and now king e6 back. Rook d5, trying to push for a5, trying to just break those pawns on the queen side. Rook g8, king f3, and now a6 first. Probably this is something that Magnus forgot about, that now after a5 he has b5. He didn't want to play it immediately, and now this would be very unpleasant for white, because now the c4 pawn is a big target. Eventually black will get rook c8 and put pressure on c4. But here it was a good chance for white to play f5, because if you take, then rook d6 is nice, and after rook g6, just to avoid this, by rook d7 and getting to a7, trying to force fixing the structure on the queen side. And now after rook b7 he would go here, king g2. Still, black has some counterplay with rook d8. It's really getting messy here. After this, king e7, rook b5, king e6. He will still be able to capture, because after rook d2 there is this, and eventually they exchange rooks, but white has plenty of pawns. But still, they're not as mobile, and they're not ideal, because the b3 pawn is very vulnerable, and after this, knight c1, black still has some chances. Magnus didn't choose to do that, he went back to d1. And now Duda plays king e7. It allowed Magnus to play f5 now. It was better just to play f5 immediately, stopping f5 forever. After king e7, Magnus played f5, and now rook g7. It was a decisive mistake, because now it allows f6. And it was better just to fix pawns on the queen side, although it looks unappealing, but it was the best, because after rook d5, let's say, king d7, he always has king c6 to hold everything on this side. But still, this is a position that is not a forced draw. Objectively it's good, but practically speaking it's a torture. White can play this forever without any risk. Black is just waiting for things to happen. It's unlikely that Duda would save this position. After f5 he went for rook g7, and now it allowed f6. But Magnus didn't play this. He played rook d5 first. He still wants to play a5, I guess. And Duda plays king f6, trying to collect this pawn, but now he took king f5 and rook b6. Rook g6, trying to defend the a6 pawn, and now Magnus plays a5. He doesn't exchange immediately, he plays that first. And now rook d8. He tries to make some counterplay on the d file, but now it allows Magnus to have a very nice tactic. He played g4, and after rook takes, knight g3. And now black is forced to give up the rook, and now he tried with e4. I think more resilient was to play king e4 and trying to play for f5, but even then allows rook f6. After, let's say, king e3 to somehow shoulder the king, you can even push the pawn, e4, c6, rook g8, king h3, and now this pawn on the e-file is not dangerous enough, because now you have rook d8 and black queens, but white has rook and queen in the end of this variation. It's not gonna work out, white is just going to escape from checks, and that's it. Duda plays e4, trying to push his pawns as soon as possible. Now Magnus took on a6, king e5, and now rook b6. He frees his a pawn to run, rook g8, king f2, and now f5. He's trying to get f4 and some kind of mating threats. Also king f4 is a nice option, trying to push the e pawn. But Magnus just ignores this, plays a6, king f4, and now a very nice prophylactic move, rook e6, stopping e3, rook g7, just defending against a7, and now it was time to push the other pawn, c5, rook d7, trying to get rook d2, but now rook d6, making a bridge on the d file, rook g7, and now rook d4. He doesn't want to allow e3 from black, and also prepares rook a4 next to support this pawn. Duda plays king e5, rook a4, and he tried this, but after a7, e3, king f1, black just resigned because he's not able to avoid promotion. Let's say he does this, white just queens, and after this rook g2, king f3. If you queen, then there is rook e4. Black is losing his newborn queen. That was it. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you found something very instructive in this game. And I'll see you soon with more recaps from this tournament. Have a good day and see you. Bye bye.